The ground was shaking. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the weight of 100,000 men marching in formation, covered in iron and dried blood under the scorching Palestinian sun. Reddish dust rose in dense columns on the horizon, as if the earth itself were trying to swallow the advancing army. Sennacherib's tents stretched across the valley like a plague, hundreds, thousands of them, and the Assyrian banners fluttered in the hot wind like the tongue of a serpent about to strike. Inside Jerusalem, the sentinels on the walls gazed at the horizon with pale faces. Some wept without realizing it. Others gripped their spears so tightly that their knuckles turned white. Down below in the city, mothers hid their children. Merchants closed their doors. The priests kneeling in the temple cried out in trembling voices to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hezekiah, king of Judah, stood on the wall, gazing into the advancing darkness. His eyes showed no fear. They showed something more complex, deeper than fear. They showed the full awareness of a man who knows he is facing something beyond his strength. And then, in the midst of that despair, the message arrived. Not from a prophet, not from an angel. It came from spies, sweaty and breathless, with sand in their hair and urgency in their eyes. The message they brought was almost impossible to believe, almost too unbelievable to be true. But there it was, written on papyrus, sealed with a symbol that no man in Jerusalem had ever seen before. The symbol of the black pharaoh, the symbol of the king who came from the south, the symbol of Tirhakah. There was a place in the world where the Nile ceased to be a river and became a promise, where the cataracts roared like lions and granite rocks emerged from the copper-colored waters, defying the very course of history. That place was Nubia, called by the Egyptians Taseti, the land of the bow, and it was in this land of warriors and gold, of incense and mystery, that the man who would one day capture the attention of the entire world was born. Tirhakah was not born in a palace, though royal blood ran in his veins. He was the son of Pianki, the Nubian pharaoh who had descended the Nile like a flood and taken Egypt with an army of archers so precise that birds did not fly low when they marched. Pianki was of the 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs, the rulers of Cush, the sons of Nubia who had inherited the double throne of Egypt, not through treachery or cowardice, but through brute force and the religious conviction that Amun, the god of gods, had called the people of the south to purify and restore the corrupted land of the pharaohs. Tirhakah grew up watching his father rule two worlds. He saw Egyptian scribes bow before a man with skin as dark as the desert night. He saw the priests of Karnak anoint his family with sacred oils. He saw the people of Memphis, proud, civilized, ancient, bow their heads before the crown of the south. And in each of these scenes, something was forming within young Tirhakah. Not arrogance, not cruelty, something far more dangerous to the enemies of justice, the absolute conviction that he had been placed in the world for a purpose. When he was only 20 years old, he was sent by his brother Zabako, who had succeeded Pianki on the throne, to train with the armies in Egypt. The separation was painful. His mother cried. He did not. He looked at her with those eyes that, since childhood, seemed to see beyond the horizon, and said something she never forgot. Tears do not convince destiny, mother. Only the steps of the traveler convince. And he walked. Tirhakah trained in Memphis, in Thebes, on the Delta Plains. He learned the language of battles, the geometry of military formations, the psychology of armies, how to make men advance when fear tells them to retreat, how to make a soldier believe that victory is possible even when the enemy seems invincible. But more than military strategy, Tirhakah learned political theology. He understood that a king who rules only with force is a tyrant. A king who rules with force and sacred purpose is a legend. Its legend began to be built at the Battle of El Teke. It was the year that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, the man who claimed to be the king of the universe, whose scribes recorded his conquests with terrifying meticulousness, had descended upon the land of Canaan like a storm. Sennacherib was not merely a warrior, he was a nation-crushing machine. He had destroyed Lachish with a cruelty that still caused survivors to wake screaming in the middle of the night. He had deported entire peoples. He had carved the images of his conquests in stone with a pleasure that revealed something dark and calculated in the heart of that man. When the coastal cities, Ashkelon, Ekron, sent messengers to Egypt pleading for help, it was Tirhakah who answered. Not because he was the pharaoh, he wasn't yet, but because the moment he had awaited since childhood had arrived. The moment when purpose and opportunity meet at the same point in time. He advanced north with his army. Elteke was a shock. Sennacherib and Tirhakah met on a battlefield that neither had fully chosen, and the outcome was recorded with differing versions in the annals of each people. Assyrian scribes claimed victory, Egyptians and Nubians said something different. But there is one fact that no scribe of any people has managed to erase. After Elteke, Sennacherib did not advance further south. He stopped. And this seemingly small detail, this simple geographical fact, that the most powerful army on known earth halted its advance and looked south more carefully than before. This fact changed the course of history. It changed the course of Jerusalem's history, because while Tirhakah held the southern flank, Hezekiah prayed. And while Hezekiah prayed, something began to stir in the unseen background. Something that wasn't on Sennacherib's maps, something that wasn't in the calculations of the Assyrian strategists, something that the scribes of the King of the universe could never engrave on their victory stones. Tirhakah didn't know yet that he was being used by a hand much bigger than his own. I didn't know that his name would be pronounced in Jerusalem with the reverence of one who pronounces a sacred name. I didn't know that decades later, when a prophet named Isaiah recorded the events of those days, the name of the African king would appear on the sacred pages as an essential piece of a divine puzzle. I didn't know that the story I was living was bigger than any story any man could invent. But sometimes God's instruments don't need to understand everything. They just need to move their feet. And Tirhakah moved their feet. You've just encountered a name most people have never heard in church, Sunday school, or any sermon. An African king, a warrior of the Nile, a man whose name appears in scripture as part of one of the most dramatic moments in Jerusalem's history. And this reveals a problem that few want to admit. Because if you've never heard of Tirhakah, if that name has been erased, ignored, set aside, what else has been erased? What else is hidden in the pages you leaf through every Sunday but never truly stop to delve into? That's where many people get lost. They read the Bible as if it were a manual, when in reality it's a map. And maps only work when you understand the symbols, the scales, the points that aren't marked but are implied in every line. There is a digital book called Revealing the Secrets of the Apocalypse that was written precisely for this purpose, to help you see what lies behind the words, behind the names, behind the events that the scriptures record, with a precision that only makes sense when you have the right key to decipher them. Not everyone realizes this. The Revelation isn't just a book about the future, it's also a book about the past, and how the past reveals recurring patterns. Patterns like this: a powerful king who thinks he controls everything, a city that seems doomed, and an unexpected instrument of God coming from a direction no one expected. It may be too late for those who continue to ignore these standards, but not for you, who are here now. Click the link in the first pinned comment and discover what the prophecies hide between the lines. If this content is already stirring something within you, write Amen in the comments. That tells me you've made it this far and want to delve deeper. No one prepares a man for the weight of a crown. No amount of training, years of observation, or absorbed wisdom can fully prepare you for the moment when the crown falls upon your head and the whole world suddenly expects you to know what to do. Tirhakah knew this theoretically, but theory is always a pale shadow of reality. When his brother Shuru died and Tirhakah ascended the dual throne of Egypt and Nubia, becoming the pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, the man who ruled from the Nile Delta to the depths of Sudan, the weight that fell upon his shoulders was not merely symbolic. It was political, religious, military, and profoundly spiritual. The Egypt he received was not the golden Egypt of the great pharaohs. It was a fractured Egypt. To the north, the coastal city-states trembled under the growth of Assyria. To the east, Sennacherib had transformed the map of the region into something unrecognizable, erasing nations as one erases writing in the sand. Trade routes were compromised. The Egyptian princes of the Delta, those who for centuries had ruled their small pockets of power with almost sovereign autonomy, now looked to Tirhakah with a mixture of hope and distrust. Hope because they needed protection. distrust because he was black. He was Nubian, he was from the south. And there was a current of veiled prejudice within Egypt, the kind of prejudice that smiles to your face but murmurs behind your back. Tirhakah knew this murmur. He had grown up with it, and he had learned something fundamental about prejudice. The best response to it is not anger, it is excellence. So he governed with excellence. He ordered the construction of temples, not as an exercise in vanity, but as a political and spiritual statement. Each temple he erected was an affirmation that the 25th dynasty was not a foreign occupation, but a sacred restoration. On the walls of Karnak, he had his victories and acts of piety engraved in impeccable hieroglyphs in the best tradition of the great pharaohs. In Thebes, he restored sanctuaries that had deteriorated. In Memphis, he installed priests he trusted and financed rituals that had not been performed with due splendor for decades. The scribes recorded, Tirhakah, beloved of Ammon, son of Ra, protector of the two lands. But while he was building, Sennacherib was destroying. News arrived from the east like open wounds. Sennacherib had crossed the Euphrates, had advanced through the Syrian-Palestinian corridor, had taken the cities one by one with a terrifying methodology. It was not war like previous wars, it was a calculated display of terror. His inscriptions openly stated, "I have made the cities like heaps of ruins." And then came the news from Lachish. Lachish was one of the most important cities in Judah, a fortress, a symbol, a stronghold that had withstood enemies for generations. Sennacherib captured it, and the manner in which he captured it was etched in stone in his own palaces in Nineveh. The reliefs of Lachish depicted Jewish prisoners being impaled, families being deported, soldiers being beheaded. It was war pornography, displayed with the pride of someone who has no shame whatsoever. When Tirhakah received the full account of what had happened at Lachish, he remained silent for a long time. His advisors waited, his generals waited. The wind that came from the north swept through the columns of the throne hall and gently stirred the flames of the torches. Then he spoke. "What is Sennacherib's next target?" "Jerusalem, sir. The Assyrian king has already sent his Rabshakehs to the front of the walls. They say he has already ordered King Hezekiah to surrender." Tirhakah closed her eyes, not out of fear, out of calculation. There was something about Jerusalem that bothered him in a way he couldn't fully explain to himself. It wasn't just strategy, although there was strategy in that, because a Judah conquered by Assyria was a much more dangerous Assyria for Egypt. It was something more, a feeling he had carried since childhood, when the priests of Ammon taught him about the city in the mountains where there was a temple unlike any other, consecrated to a god who had no statue, no form, could not be represented in gold or stone, but whom his devotees claimed was the only real God, the only true God. Tirhakah had pondered this more times than anyone knew. In his moments of solitude, and the king experiences far more solitude than people imagine, he would gaze at the idols of Ammon, Ra, and Ptah, and wonder if there was something beyond them. If there was a deeper reality than mythology, if that formless God whom the Hebrews worshipped in the mountains was, in some way, the answer to a question he had never been able to formulate precisely. I had no answer. Not yet. But he had an army, and he had a growing conviction that the time had come to use it. "Prepare the troops," he said. "We're marching north." Their generals exchanged glances. Marching north meant clashing, sooner or later, with the largest army in the known world. It meant challenging Sennacherib, the man who had etched in stone that no god of any nation had escaped his grasp. It meant gambling the survival of the 25th dynasty on a move many would consider suicidal. But none of them uttered a word of objection, because there was something in Tirhakah's voice at that moment that wasn't just the voice of a king. It was the voice of a man who believes with every fiber of his being that he is on the right side. And armies march much faster when they believe they are on the right side. In Jerusalem, terror had a name. His name was Rabshakeh. He was Sennacherib's spokesman, a man with a powerful voice and a vocabulary calibrated to destroy not bodies but minds. He stood before the walls of Jerusalem and shouted in Hebrew, deliberately, strategically in Hebrew, so that every sentry, every soldier, every citizen who peered through the cracks in the stones could understand every word, and what he said was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. What kind of confidence do you have? Do you think words are strategy and strength for war? Who do you trust to rebel against me? Egypt? Egypt is a rotten reed. When someone leans on it, it goes into their hand and pierces it. That's how Pharaoh is to all who trust in him. Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, Hezekiah's representatives who had gone out to negotiate, asked Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic so that the people on the walls wouldn't understand. The response was even more cruel. Rabshakeh raised his voice and shouted even louder in pure Hebrew so that every word would reach every ear. Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, he cannot deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord. Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvim, Hena, and Iva? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Which of all the gods of these lands has delivered his land from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? Silence. The people on the walls fell silent because the king had ordered them not to answer, but the silence had a texture of terror that was palpable, that you could almost touch with your hands. When Hezekiah received the report, he tore his clothes. Not as a performance, as a genuine expression of anguish that went beyond words. He put on sackcloth and went to the temple. And in the temple, in that space of stone and gold, where the invisible and the visible met, he knelt before the Ark of the Covenant and did something no military strategist would teach. He prayed. Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heavens and the earth. Incline your ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to blaspheme against the living God. And then came Isaiah, the prophet who had accompanied Hezekiah's reign like a spiritual sword, who had announced both warnings and promises, who had seen visions that would turn the hair of any mortal white. Isaiah entered the temple with the calm step of one who carries a message and knows exactly its weight. Thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. A rumor. Enigmatic words. The prophet did not say, I will send an army. He did not say, fire will rain from the sky. He said he will hear a rumor. And then the rumor arrived. The spies' message entered Jerusalem like a warm breeze laden with hope. Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, had set out to fight against Sennacherib. He was marching from the south. He was coming. When Sennacherib received this same news, that the Black Pharaoh had left the Nile and was advancing through the Palestinian corridor, something happened within him that his scribes never recorded in stone, because Assyrian scribes only recorded victories. And what happened within Sennacherib at that moment was not a victory, it was hesitation. The hesitation lasted a second, but a second is enough to change the course of a battle. It's enough to reveal a fracture. It's enough for forces operating beyond human comprehension to find the opening they need. Sennacherib sent new messengers to Hezekiah, this time in writing, in a letter that distilled all the arrogance of Assyrian power in ink on papyrus. The letter said, in essence, do not believe that your God will deliver you from me. All the gods of all nations have already fallen. Yours will fall too. Hezekiah took the letter. He opened it. He read it word for word. And then he took it to the temple and spread it out before the Lord, as one who presents evidence in a divine trial. Lord, save us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord, you alone. Out there in the valley, smoke from the Assyrian camps stained the horizon. Up south, the sandals of 100,000 Nubian and Egyptian soldiers kicked up clouds of dust toward the north. And somewhere between these 2 points, invisible, without armies, without horses, and without chariots, something moved with a speed no man could measure. There was a battle that wasn't happening in the valley. He wasn't in the records of military strategists. He wasn't on the maps of generals. He wasn't in the calculations of princes who weighed armies like merchants weigh gold. This battle was taking place on a plain that most mortals never see, but that some, in moments of deepest inner silence, can feel as if they were sensing the pressure shift before a storm. Miguel was in that place. The celestial warrior, who had been designated from the beginning of time as the protector of Israel, observed the events with that awareness that celestial beings possess, an awareness that is not imprisoned in linear time like human consciousness, that can see the before and after simultaneously, that understands the eternal weight of decisions that to mortals seem merely political or military. And he saw what was at stake. It wasn't just Jerusalem, it wasn't just the survival of one city among so many that the Assyrians had destroyed. It was a line of descent, a line of promise, a line that had been woven by God himself at the moment he spoke to Abraham in the desert of Canaan and said, "I will make you into a great nation." That line ran through Jerusalem. That line needed to survive, because from that line, decades, centuries, millennia later, would come the one who would change everything. And then there were the forces working on the other side. It wasn't just the Assyrian armies. The Assyrian armies were merely the visible layer. Behind them, fueling Sennacherib's arrogance, sustaining his conviction that he was the chosen man to subdue the entire world, something operated in the shadows with a coldness and strategy that grotesquely mirrored divine strategy. Like a negative photograph mirroring a positive image. The message had been clear. Blaspheme against the living God. Say that he is like the other gods. Say that he cannot save. Make the people of Jerusalem lose faith before they lose the battle. Because an army that loses faith has already lost everything before the first soldier falls. And there were times when the strategy worked. There were times when Hezekiah, alone in his chambers while the noise of the enemy camp carried on the wind, felt his faith waver like a flame on a stormy night. There were times when the priests in the temple looked at the Ark of the Covenant and felt the emptiness that sometimes amidst terror seizes human souls. That emptiness that whispers, what if there is no answer? What if silence is the answer? But there were also the knees. Because in Jerusalem during those tense nights, there were people who couldn't sleep. There were hands raised in the dark. There were lips that moved in desperate but not hopeless whispers. There were children who had learned from their mothers that when all seems lost, what remains is exactly enough for faith to function. And there was Tirhakah, the pharaoh marching north, unsure of exactly what drove him with such urgency, sometimes halting his march and gazing at the starry Negev sky with a strange feeling, as if being pulled by an invisible rope towards something far beyond political strategy or the protection of Egyptian trade routes. His generals noticed. Some of them whispered amongst themselves at night, "The pharaoh seems possessed by something. He's not acting merely as king. He's acting as something else, like someone who has received a mission that he himself doesn't fully understand." One night, encamped 3 days' march from where the Assyrians were besieging Jerusalem, Tirhakah summoned his personal advisor, an old, wise man who had served his father and who knew more about the spiritual world than most people wanted to know. "Tell me, Amenhotep, do you believe that there are forces that move kings like pawns on a chessboard?" The old man raised his eyebrows. "Sir, don't treat me like a naive student. You know what I'm talking about. Ever since we crossed the Delta, I felt something, as if every step I take is simultaneously my decision and not my decision, as if I'm being used by something I have no name to call." Amenhotep remained silent for a long moment. The fire of the campfire between them crackled. In the distance, the desert night was punctuated by the distant sounds of the camp. "My lord," the old man finally said, "the priests of Ammon say that the gods use kings for their purposes. But the Hebrews say something different. They say that their God uses even kings who do not know him, that he is able to move even those who are not his to protect those who are." Tirhakah looked at the fire. "Are you saying I can be an instrument of a God who is not my own? I'm saying that perhaps the most important question isn't which God you're an instrument of, but whether what you're doing is right." Tirhakah kept that phrase in his head for a long time. It resonated in that inner space between what we know and what we feel, in that territory where great men make their greatest decisions. If what you're doing is right, he progressed faster the next day. It was a night of a new moon. Complete darkness fell over the valley, over the camp, over the tents, where 185,000 men slept with their shields, their swords, their horses, their plans for destruction. It was the quietest night that region had witnessed in weeks, the kind of silence that is not peace, but the anteroom to something enormous. No sentry saw anything. There was no way to see it. What passed through that camp that morning was invisible to the human eye. It wasn't a cloud of smoke, it wasn't lightning, it wasn't a heat wave. It was something formless within the categories that human language uses to describe things. It was presence. It was judgment. It was the silent expression of a sovereignty that doesn't need to make noise to be absolute. The sacred text records with a sobriety that is more terrifying than any dramatic description could be. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when the rest arose in the morning, behold, they were all dead, 185,000, in one night. No battle, no blood on swords, no cries of those fighting hand to hand. Just the morning arriving, the rising sun illuminating the tents, and silence. The wrong silence, not the silence of a sleeping camp, but the silence of a camp that will not wake. The survivors, those beyond the reach of the sentence, those who perhaps couldn't even explain why they woke up when others didn't, fled. They ran north, east, in any direction that would take them away from that valley that had become something different during the night. Sennacherib was among them, the man who had engraved in stone that he was the king of the universe. The man whose scribes listed destroyed cities with the coldness of accountants recording commercial transactions. The man who had stood before Lachish and watched with satisfaction the deportation of an entire people. This man ran this. He returned to Nineveh. He returned to his palace, to his columns, to his stone reliefs, where scenes of victory were engraved for eternity. And in an irony that only history produces, it was in his own temple, kneeling before his own God, that his sons killed him with the sword. When news of all this reached the camp at Tirhakah, which had halted its march when the spies brought back the first reports of what had happened in the valley before Jerusalem, Pharaoh remained silent for a long time. It wasn't the silence of confusion, it was the silence of someone who had just seen a piece fit into a puzzle he hadn't put together. It was the silence of an intelligent man who perceives, with all possible clarity, that something was happening that was beyond his understanding and beyond his control, and that this something had resulted in exactly what he had marched towards achieving. Jerusalem was saved, not because of his armies. His march had been an element, but not the decisive one. There was something else. There was a force that wasn't in the war manuals, wasn't in the stories of the priests of Amun, wasn't in any religious category he knew. There was a God who was at work, a God who used African pharaohs and Jewish prophets and the laments of a king kneeling in a stone temple and the darkness of a new moon night, and from all of this, from all these seemingly disconnected pieces, had woven something that no human strategist could have planned. Tirhakah summoned his advisor again. Amenhotep, that God of the Hebrews, what do you know about him? What do the priests of Memphis know, sir? That he is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, that he has no form, that he cannot be represented, that he chose a people to be his special people, that he made promises and he fulfills them. He makes promises and keeps them, Tirhakah repeated slowly, as if savoring each word. Have you ever heard that said about Ammon? The old man hesitated. Not in the same way, sir. Tirhakah nodded. He gazed northward toward Jerusalem, which lay beyond the hills, invisible yet ever present. Send messengers to King Hezekiah. Tell them that Tirhakah, pharaoh of Egypt and Nubia, greets Hezekiah, king of Judah, and wishes that his God bless him. Amenhotep blinked. Are you greeting the God of the Hebrews? I recognize what I saw, Tirhakah said simply. A king who doesn't recognize what he sees is a fool, and I am not a fool. The message was sent, and on the other side of the hills, when Hezekiah received the greeting from the African pharaoh, the king of Judah looked up at the sky with teary eyes and smiled in a way that his servants had rarely seen on that face, marked by weeks of anguish. Because sometimes God's confirmation comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes it comes from the hills. Sometimes it comes from the prophet. Sometimes it comes from the army that marched to save you and didn't even need to raise a sword. And sometimes it comes from an African king who sends word, through messengers that he recognizes what he has seen. There are words that history inscribes with diluted ink, and there are words that history inscribes with fire. Tirhakah's name was written with fire, not because he ordered it to be so. The great pharaohs of Egypt spent their entire lives commissioning inscriptions, commissioning obelisks, commissioning entire temples so that their names would survive the centuries. Tirhakah did this too. There are inscriptions of his in Karnak, in Kawa, in Sanam, in dozens of places scattered along the Nile corridor. But these inscriptions, however grand they may be, are not what makes his name shine in the darkness of the centuries. What makes his name shine is one line, a single line in the sacred book, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 9, Isaiah chapter 37 verse 9, the same line in two books. And news came to Sennacherib, saying, Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, has come out to fight with you. One line, 20-odd words. And in those 20-odd words, the full weight of a historical presence that has survived all attempts at erasure, all revisions, all centuries of commentary that ignored or minimized it. Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, or of Cush, as the original Hebrew texts say, Cush being the biblical name for Nubia, for the territory that is now Sudan and part of Egypt. An African king, in the midst of the most important story in the Old Testament, at the moment when the chosen people were about to be destroyed. Right there. And modern scholars, the archaeologists who excavated the remains of Nineveh, the historians who unearthed the Assyrian annals, the epigraphers who spent decades deciphering the inscriptions of the Black Pharaohs, all of them have confirmed what the Bible said. Tirhakah existed, he ruled, he marched north. His name appears in the inscriptions of Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, who describes him as his enemy to be fought. His name appears on his own monuments, where he describes himself as protector of Egypt, restorer of the temples, defender of the two lands. Secular history and sacred history point to the same man, but there is a dimension to what Tirhakah represented that goes beyond archaeology. There is a theological dimension that the first readers of the scriptures understood immediately, and which today, when we look with the eyes of the 21st century, we can see even more clearly. Tirhakah was a Gentile. He was a non-Israelite. He was someone who grew up in a completely different religious context, who worshipped other gods, who was not part of the covenant that God had established with Abraham. And yet, God used him. God placed this man on the right path, at the right time, with the right resources in the right political and military position, to be an instrument of protection for God's people. This was no accident. It was theology. It was the same theology that would later appear in the story of Cyrus the Persian, whom God would call his anointed one, even though he was not Jewish. It was the same theology that would appear in Ruth, the Moabite woman who chose the God of Israel. It was the same theology that Jesus himself would articulate when he said that many would come from the east and the west to sit at the table of the kingdom, while others would be left out. God cannot fit into the boxes that men build for him. God is not the property of one ethnicity, culture, or specific religious tradition. It is the God of Abraham who calls Tirhakah. It is the God of Moses who moves the Nubian armies. It is the God of Isaiah who uses an African pharaoh as an instrument of his sovereignty. And there is something more, something that black biblical scholars, especially in Africa and the African diasporas in the Americas, have identified with a depth and emotion that other academic traditions have often neglected. Africa played a role in the salvation of Jerusalem, not as a backdrop, not as a decorative element, as an agent, as an instrument, as an active and necessary presence in the divine plan. The son of Nubia, the Black Pharaoh, the king who came from the south where the Nile was deeper and the stars were brighter, this man was woven into the fabric of sacred history with the same importance as any other character that centuries of European interpretation have placed center stage. This matters. It matters to Africans and their descendants who sometimes look at the scriptures and wonder, where am I in this story? Am I here only as a slave, as the oppressed, as one who needs to be saved? Or am I also here as a warrior, as a protector, as an instrument of God? Tirhakah answers that question, and the answer is yes. Did you realize what just happened? I'm not talking about the story of Tirhakah, although it is extraordinary. I'm talking about what it reveals about how the scriptures work, about what is buried in the pages we turn with the speed of someone who is in a hurry, but not hungry. Because Tirhakah is not an exception, it's the norm. Throughout the scriptures, especially in Revelation, the book of Daniel, and the major prophets, there are characters, symbols, and events that have been systematically undervalued, misinterpreted, or simply ignored because they require a level of historical and spiritual context that most superficial readings fail to grasp. And when you don't understand these patterns, you start interpreting the present with the wrong tools. The digital book Revealing the Secrets of the Apocalypse was created to provide these tools, to show how the same God who used Tirhakah, who used Cyrus, who used the unlikely figures of each generation, that same God is working today in the events you see in the news, in the crises that seem unsolvable, in the unexpected twists of fate. When it starts to make sense, when biblical patterns begin to illuminate the present, you can no longer look at the world the same way. You can no longer have the same anxiety, the same despair, the same sense that things are out of control. Because nothing is out of control. It never has been. The link is in the first pinned comment. Access is for a limited time, and those who have already downloaded it know what that means. Don't put off until later what could change the way you read the scriptures today. Write Amen in the comments if you've made it this far. I want to know who's on this journey with me. Empires have selective memory. Assyria engraved in stone every city it destroyed, every king it humiliated, every deportation it carried out. Its scribes worked with the dedication of those who know that the narrative of power is as important as power itself. And so, when Sennacherib's army returned without the trophy of Jerusalem, when the city of stone walls remained standing while 185,000 men had fallen at dawn, the scribes simply did not write about it. They wrote about other victories. They wrote about other conquests. The episode of Jerusalem remained blank in the Assyrian annals, an eloquent silence that screamed exactly what it tried to keep quiet about. But Egypt also has its selective memory. The 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs, the Nubian rulers, had its reign erased from many Egyptian monuments by the dynasties that came after. Their faces were carved out of walls, their names were replaced. The official narrative of Egypt, built over centuries of fluctuating political power, has sometimes preferred to pretend that this period of African rule never happened, or to diminish it, or to frame it as an anomaly. But the stone is stubborn, and the scriptures are even more stubborn. Because while the Assyrian scribes left it blank and the Egyptian revisers carved over the faces, the sacred text remained. Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia. There, fixed, immobile as a rock in the middle of the Nile River during the flood. The water flows over, under to the sides, but the rock remains there when the flood passes. Tirhakah continued to reign for several years after the Jerusalem episode. He ruled with the awareness of someone who had participated in something greater than himself. His monuments from this period reveal a subtle but perceptible shift, a greater emphasis on piety, on offerings to the gods, on a spiritual quest that his inscriptions only suggest, but do not openly declare. There was something he had seen, or felt, or witnessed, that had changed the inner fabric of his life. There was no biblical name for it. There was no language of conversion, of revelation, of covenant. But there was the reality of a man who had come close enough to something sacred to never be quite the same again. His final years were marked by the struggle against Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, who, unlike his father, actually invaded Egypt and captured Memphis in 671 BC. It was a devastating defeat. Tirhakah was forced to retreat south to Nubia, to the lands of Cush, from where his family had set out to conquer Egypt decades earlier. It's easy to interpret this defeat as the end of the story, as proof that military power always wins in the end, as justification for cynicism. But there is another possible interpretation. There is an interpretation that Tirhakah had done what he had been called to do. He had marched when it was time to march. He had been an instrument when it was time to be an instrument. And that the subsequent defeat did not erase the previous victory, just as the fact that Peter later denied Jesus 3 times does not erase the fact that Peter had said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." God's instruments are not perfect. They are suited to the moment. And at the moment when Jerusalem needed it, Tirhakah was suitable. Their sons and grandsons would continue to rule in Nubia for centuries. The so-called 25th dynasty did not disappear with the defeat at Memphis. It merely retreated to its ancestral heartland. The kings of Meroe who came after, would build pyramids that still exist today in Sudan, smaller than the Egyptian pyramids, but no less impressive. And in each of them there is an echo of the grandeur of the dynasty that had produced Tirhakah. There's also something that few people notice. In the Gospels, when the Magi, the wise men from the east, come to Bethlehem to find the baby Jesus, they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold and frankincense were products that came, among other places, from Nubia and the roots that Nubia controlled. The African continent once again sending its gifts to an event that would change the world. And in the book of Acts, the first non-Jewish Gentile to receive the gospel from Philip, the first foreigner to be baptized in the history of the Christian church, was an Ethiopian, an official of the Queen of Ethiopia, a man returning from Jerusalem, reading the prophet Isaiah, who was reached on the road by a heavenly messenger, Isaiah, the same prophet who had recorded the name Tirhakah, the same prophet who had announced the liberation of Jerusalem from the Assyrian siege, the same prophet who had written visions of a time when all nations, all peoples, all colors of humanity would unite before a single throne. It is no accident that the first Gentile convert in the book of Acts was from the same geographical region as Tirhakah. It is continuity. It is the same golden thread that runs through the sacred narrative, connecting the warrior king of the 8th century BC to the eunuch reader of Isaiah from the 1st century AD, Africa and scriptures. Not as a margin, as a thread. There is a question that this entire script has been building, brick by brick, without ever directly formulating it. The time has come to formulate it. The question is this: what does it mean to you today, right now, at this moment in your life? What does it mean that God used an African king who was not of the covenant people, who worshipped other gods, who came from another continent, to protect the people of Israel in their moment of greatest vulnerability? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a question that has an answer, and the answer has practical consequences for how you live your faith. The first consequence is this: God is not confined to your expectations. When Hezekiah was kneeling in the temple with Sennacherib's letters spread out before the Lord, he wasn't saying, "Well, Lord, send your angel, or send an army of Israel, or work in a way that I can immediately recognize as yours." He was saying, "Save us." Period. The method he left to God, and God sent Tirhakah. How many times in your life have you prayed for something, specified the exact form the answer should take, and when the answer arrived in a different package than you had specified, you didn't recognize it as an answer? How many times has God's instrument arrived from an unexpected direction, an unlikely person, a seemingly accidental circumstance, a seemingly small opportunity, and you let it pass because it didn't have the form you had requested? Tirhakah was an unexpected format, and it was exactly the right format. The second consequence is this: God sees beyond the categories that men construct. Tirhakah was African in a story that many traditional Eurocentric interpretations portray as essentially Mediterranean. He was a Gentile, in a narrative often presented as exclusively Jewish. He was king of a rival power in a plot where you would expect rival powers to be obstacles, not instruments. And God chose him anyway. This means that grace has no geographical boundaries, that the divine calling does not respect ethnic barriers, that God's sovereignty operates as freely in a Nubian court on the banks of the Nile as in a temple in Jerusalem. That when God says all peoples, he is not using a figure of speech, he is literally describing all peoples. You have a place in this story. It doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter the color of your skin, it doesn't matter if you grew up in a different religious tradition, it doesn't matter if you arrived too late or through a different door than the main door. Tirhakah arrived from the south, and that was exactly where he needed to arrive. The third consequence is the most personal and perhaps the most difficult to digest. Tirhakah didn't fully understand what he was doing. He lacked the theology, the language, and the complete map of the divine plan in which he was involved. He had conviction, he had movement, he had the willingness to march even without knowing all the details, and that was enough. How many times have you stopped along the way because you weren't sure enough? Because the information was incomplete? Because you wanted to understand the whole plan before taking the first step? How many times has analysis paralyzed action, and the action that wasn't taken left some Jerusalem unprotected in your life? Some relationship that needed defending? Some child who needed presence? some cause that needed someone to march north. Tirhakah teaches us that the instrument doesn't need to have the complete map. It needs to have the step. And there is a fourth thing, the quietest and most profound of all. Tirhakah was left with the question about that formless God, that God of the Hebrews, that God who had done something that morning that no God of any pantheon had ever done. He carried that question within him, lived with it, probably died with it, without ever having a complete formal answer. But the question itself was already a step towards the truth. Sometimes the question is the beginning of faith. Sometimes faith doesn't begin with certainty, but with restlessness, with the feeling that there is something more, that what you have always believed is true but incomplete, that there is a layer of reality that you have not yet fully accessed. If you are watching this video with this unease within you, if there is something in this story that you can't fully explain, but that stirs something deep within you, then you are exactly where Tirhakah was that night, gazing into the fire and asking his advisor about the God of the Hebrews. And you already have the answer he received. It's in the pages you have at home. It's in the voice that brought you to this video. It's in the silence that remains after the noise of the world stops for a moment, and you can hear something that has no measurable frequency, but that you recognize as real. Tirhakah marched north because something inside him knew he should. You know what you have to do. We live in the time of Sennacherib, not because there is an Assyrian army at our doorstep, although there are modern forms of siege that are just as terrifying as the army of the King of the universe. We live in a time of Sennacherib because we live in a time when the voices that shout in Hebrew for the people to hear, that say there is no way out, that there is no hope, that their God cannot save, those voices are louder than ever. On social media, in the news, in the cynicism that has come to be considered wisdom, and in the hopelessness that many mistake for realism. And in the face of these voices, Hezekiah's response, to go to the temple, spread the letter before the Lord, and simply say, "Save us." That response seems naive. It seems small. It seems insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the problem. But Tirhakah was marching, even when you didn't know. Even when the walls seemed too fragile and the enemy too strong. Even when the prophet spoke of something abstract like a rumor, and you couldn't see how a rumor could stop an army. Tirhakah was marching. And beneath Tirhakah, deeper than any army, more real than any strategy, there was a sovereignty that neither sleeps nor slumbers, that does not abandon its promises halfway, that does not fear the size of the enemy because the size of the enemy is ultimately relative. The second lesson of this story is that God has instruments you never considered, not just African kings marching with armies, but also the coworker who asked you a question at the right moment, the illness that forced you to stop and rethink, the child who was born when you didn't plan, the failure that redirected you to the path you needed to follow. Each of these instruments marching south, approaching the siege of your life from an angle you hadn't monitored, arriving exactly on time. The third thing, and the most important thing I want you to take away from this story, is that Tirhakah was remembered. In a text that survived empires, persecutions, centuries of attempts at erasure, a text that you can open today on your cell phone, on your computer, in a paper Bible, in any language, Tirhakah's name is there. One line, but a line that lasted 3,000 years. This should tell us something about what God considers worthy of being remembered. Not just the kings who built temples in his honor, not just the prophets who spoke in his name, but also the one who, marching from afar, coming from an unexpected direction, without having the complete map and without fully understanding the purpose, did what needed to be done, at the right time, in the right place, for the right reason. And that was enough for his name to be written in fire. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on where you're watching from. May God bless you. Amen.